I spotted my son sitting on a bench outside the Tim Hortons on Bloor Street. He had a duffel bag at his feet, a backpack over one shoulder, and my granddaughter Charlotte asleep against his arm. It was February. The kind of cold that comes off Lake Ontario and settles into your bones. I had driven past on my way to a meeting downtown and nearly missed him entirely. I pulled over. I got out. I walked up slowly because I did not want to startle Charlotte. My son looked up, and when he saw me, something in his face broke open. Not tears. Just that particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a person has been holding themselves together for too long. I sat down beside him on that bench. I did not say anything for a moment. I just looked at him. At the shadows under his eyes, at the way his coat was not warm enough for the weather, at Charlotte's little red mittens that had fallen half off her hands while she slept. I asked him how long he had been sitting there. He said since 7 that morning. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon. I said, "Get up. Bring Charlotte. We are going." He started to say something about not wanting to be a burden. I told him we would have that conversation later. Right now. He needed to get in the car where it was warm. I want to tell you something before I go further. I am 63 years old. I grew up in a small town outside of Halifax. The daughter of a woman who cleaned offices at night and a man who drove trucks until his back gave out. We were not wealthy. We were not connected. What I built? I built quietly and carefully over 40 years. And I built it in a way that meant most people I encountered had no idea what I was actually worth. That was always intentional. I learned early that people treat you differently when they know what you have. I preferred to be treated for who I was. My son had married into a family that believed very strongly in appearances. His father-in-law ran a mid-sized commercial real estate company based in Mississauga. The kind of man who measured other people in square footage and net worth. He had never made a secret of the fact that he thought my son was not good enough for his daughter. My son had worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Toronto. Solid work. Honest work. But not flashy enough. Apparently, for a man like my son's father-in-law, for 6 years I had watched my son shrink. Slowly. The way a tree loses leaves in autumn you barely notice until one day the branches are bare. He stopped talking about his projects. He stopped laughing at the table at Christmas. He started apologizing for things that did not require apology. My daughter-in-law was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was caught between 2 worlds, and she did not know how to stand in either one. She loved my son. I believe that. But she loved her father's approval more, and those 2 things were not compatible. It had been my son's father-in-law who suggested he leave his engineering firm to come work at the family company, help manage the infrastructure side of their development projects. It sounded like an olive branch. I was not so sure. I told my son privately that he should keep his professional certifications current and maintain his relationships in the industry regardless of what he decided. He thanked me and then did exactly what his father-in-law wanted. Within 2 years, my son had reorganized the company's entire project management structure. He brought in systems that cut their construction timelines by nearly a quarter and flagged a series of code compliance issues on 2 of their major builds that, had they gone unnoticed, would have cost the company millions in fines and liability. He was good at his job. He was very good at his job. His father-in-law never acknowledged it directly. Instead, he began what I can only describe as a quiet campaign. Small things at first. Crediting other staff members in meetings for work my son had done, introducing him at industry events as my daughter's husband, rather than by his actual role. Making comments at family dinners about how lucky my son was to have been given such an opportunity. As though the work itself meant nothing. My son told me about some of it. I think he kept most of it to himself because he did not want me to worry. Or perhaps because saying it out loud would have made it too real. Then in January, his father-in-law called him into the office and told him his position was being eliminated. He said the company was restructuring. He said it professionally, with HR present, with the appropriate 2 weeks of severance under the Ontario Employment Standards Act. He shook my son's hand afterward. My son told me he almost laughed at the handshake, which is how I knew how deeply it had actually hurt him. What happened the following week was harder to explain. My daughter-in-law's family owned the house my son and his wife and Charlotte had been living in. It had been presented as a gift when they married. A house in Oakville. A beautiful house. What had never been made fully clear, what had been buried in the paperwork my son had signed when they moved in, was that the title had never actually transferred. The house remained in a family trust controlled by his father-in-law. My son had consulted a real estate lawyer briefly at the time and been told everything looked standard. It had not looked standard. It had been structured in a way that allowed the family to reclaim it with relatively short notice. The notice came 8 days after my son lost his job. A formal letter from his father-in-law's lawyer, 30 days to vacate, citing a clause in the trust agreement that allowed reclamation if a family member was no longer employed by the company. My son did not call me when he got the letter. He did not call me when his wife, in tears, and clearly not entirely in agreement with her father but also not willing to fight him, suggested that perhaps he should stay somewhere else while they figured things out. He did not call me when he packed his bag and took Charlotte for the day because she had been asking to see her dad and his wife had said yes. Take her. Go. He sat on that bench instead. I asked him in the car. Once Charlotte had woken up and was in the back seat eating the granola bar I found in my glove compartment, why he had not called me. He said he did not want me to think he had failed. I kept my eyes on the road. I let a few seconds pass. Then I told him that I had never once in his entire life thought of him as a failure, and that sitting on a bench in February with his daughter, rather than leaving her somewhere uncertain, was not failure. That was a father. He looked out the window. Charlotte asked if we were going to Grandma's house. I told her yes, and that there would be hot chocolate when we got there. I live in a house in the East End of Toronto, not far from the beaches. Nothing ostentatious. A Victorian semi that I bought in 1991 and have renovated carefully over the years. My son has always known it as the place where he grew up. What he has never fully understood, because I never felt the need to tell him in a way that made it feel like leverage, is that the house next to mine and the one 2 doors down are also mine, as rental properties, and that the company I own, a supply chain logistics and procurement consulting firm that I started in a spare bedroom in 1998, has contracts with a number of major commercial real estate developers across the GTA and Southern Ontario, including, as it happened, his father-in-law's company. I want to be precise here, because I think precision matters. I did not set any of this up. I did not engineer a situation to trap anyone or manufacture a confrontation. What I did, over 25 years, was build something real and maintain relationships honestly and do good work. The connection between my firm and my son's father-in-law's company had existed for 11 years. His company had no idea that the principal of Gemstone Logistics Solutions and the mother of the man who managed their infrastructure division were the same person. I had not hidden it. It had simply never come up. My son knew what I did, but had never made the connection because I had never named specific clients to him. And he had never asked. I found out about the connection myself only 3 years into my son's marriage, when a contract renewal crossed my desk, and I noticed the company name. I had thought about it carefully at the time. I had spoken to my own lawyer. I had determined that there was no conflict of interest, that I had no fiduciary obligation to disclose a personal family connection in the absence of any overlap in business decisions, and that the relationship could continue cleanly as long as I maintained the same professional distance I always had. And I had, But that was before. The first thing I did after getting my son and Charlotte settled that evening was call my lawyer, not to plan anything aggressive, to understand my options and my son's options clearly. I needed to know exactly where things stood before I did anything at all. My son's situation was difficult, but not hopeless. The house in Oakville was almost certainly lost. The trust structure was legitimate, even if it had been deliberately obscure. And fighting it would take time and money and cause pain. More useful would be establishing whether his termination had been conducted properly and whether the timing and circumstances created grounds for a wrongful dismissal claim. His lawyer, whom I helped him retain the next morning. I thought there was a reasonable case. The connection between the job elimination and the subsequent housing notice, separated by only 8 days, suggested a coordinated pressure campaign rather than a genuine restructuring. That was worth pursuing. The second thing I did was look at my own contracts. My firm was in the middle of a significant procurement consulting engagement with my son's father-in-law's company. We were sourcing materials and coordinating logistics for a large mixed-use development they were building in Burlington. The engagement was worth approximately $480,000 over 18 months. We were about 7 months in. I reviewed the contract carefully. I had the right to terminate with 60 days' notice for any reason outside of project-critical phases. We were not in a project-critical phase. My obligations through to the 60-day mark were clearly defined, and I could meet them cleanly. I did not make any decisions that night. I have learned over the years that decisions made in the immediate heat of anger are rarely the right decisions. I went to bed. I woke up at 5:30, as I always do. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with my notebooks, and I thought for 2 hours. Then I called my son downstairs. I told him what I was about to tell him, not to alarm him, but because he deserved to know, and because I did not do things behind my own family's back. I told him about the contract. I told him what I was considering. I told him I wanted his honest opinion. He was quiet for a long time. Charlotte was still asleep upstairs. The kitchen was warm, and the light outside was just starting to come up. Gray and quiet the way February mornings are in Toronto. He asked me if I would be hurting my business. I told him I would be managing a contract exit, that it would cost me some revenue in the short term, and that I had done harder things. He asked me if it was worth it. I told him that was the wrong question. The right question was whether continuing to provide services that directly benefited a man who had spent 6 years undermining my son and had recently coordinated what amounted to a campaign to destabilize his life was something I was willing to do. And the answer to that question was no. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked up at me. He asked me if I had planned this. If I had been waiting for the chance, I told him no. I told him I had hoped it would never come to this. I told him I would have been genuinely happy to sit at Christmas dinners for the rest of my life and nod politely to his father-in-law and never say a word about any of this. If his father-in-law had simply treated my son with basic professional decency, my son nodded slowly. He said, "Okay." I sent the notice of termination to my son's father-in-law's company on a Thursday morning. Formal. Professional. As required under the contract. No explanation beyond what was legally necessary. 60 days notice. Clear accounting of outstanding deliverables. Offer to conduct a full handover. The response came faster than I expected. His father-in-law called my office directly. My assistant told him I was unavailable. He called again the following morning. I was available that time. I answered. He asked me why I was ending the contract. He used a tone. I recognized the tone of a man who is used to people accommodating him. He said the timing was disruptive. He said they were counting on our deliverables for the Burlington project. He said he hoped we could resolve whatever the issue was. I was very calm. I told him that I had exercised my contractual right to terminate, that I would fulfill all obligations through the notice period, and that my team would ensure a complete handover. He asked again if there was something he could do to change my mind. I told him that I didn't think so. There was a pause. Then he said my name in a slightly different tone, not the accommodating one. A harder one. He said he hoped this wasn't personal. I said, I hope so too. He must have looked me up after that call. Or had someone do it for him. Because 4 days later I received a different call. From someone at his company I had never spoken to directly. Asking whether I would be willing to meet. I agreed to a meeting. It was held at a hotel in Mississauga. A boardroom they used for external meetings. His father-in-law came with his operations director and his in-house counsel. I came alone. I want to describe him accurately so you understand what I was dealing with. He was in his late 60s. Well-dressed. The kind of man who has been the most important person in every room he has entered for 30 years and has stopped being able to perceive rooms in any other way. He sat at the head of the table, even though it was a borrowed room. He opened the conversation by saying he understood that family situations could be complicated and that he wanted to have a frank discussion. I said, please go ahead. He said that he was aware of the connection between my business and my son's recent departure from the company. He said that he wanted me to understand that the decision had been made on business grounds, not personal ones. He said that he respected what I had built. He had done some research. He said, and he was genuinely impressed and that he thought there was a way forward that worked for everyone. I asked him what he had in mind. He said that if I was willing to continue the engagement, he was prepared to revisit the severance package offered to my son and potentially discuss a consulting role that might suit him better going forward. I looked at him. He had just offered to treat my son slightly less badly in exchange for the continued use of my work. He had packaged it as generosity. He had packaged it as a solution. I told him I appreciated him coming. I told him the contract termination would stand. He looked at me the way men like him look at women like me when we do not do what they expect. It is a particular look. I have seen it many times. It is the look of someone recalibrating, trying to determine what category you belong to now that you have left the category they had placed you in. I gathered my folder. I thanked the operations director, who had said nothing the entire meeting and looked vaguely uncomfortable. I thanked the in-house counsel. I stood up. His father-in-law said my name again. He said surely we could come to some arrangement. I told him that the best arrangement, and I meant this sincerely, would have been for him to treat my son the way any employer should treat a competent and dedicated employee. That arrangement had been available to him for 6 years. I told him I hoped his next chapter included learning how to take that option when it was offered. Then I left. I drove back to Toronto on the 403 with the radio off. The sky over the lake was the color of old pewter. I thought about my son when he was 7 years old. The way he used to spread his drawings across the kitchen floor and explain them to me in complete seriousness. The angles and the structures. Already an engineer, in his mind before he had the word for it. I thought about Charlotte asking whether we were going to Grandma's house. I thought about the bench on Bloor Street. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved cleanly and quickly, because it did not. My son's wrongful dismissal claim went through several months of negotiations before settling. The settlement was confidential, but it was fair. The Oakville house was vacated. My son did not want to fight it on principle when the legal reality was what it was. And I respected that. He and Charlotte stayed with me while he got back on his feet. My daughter-in-law and my son had long and difficult conversations. I stayed out of those. What happens between two people who still love each other but have hurt each other is not something a mother can fix or should try to fix. What I can tell you is that by April, my son had been approached by 2 firms, one of which had worked with him before he joined his father-in-law's company and had heard through the industry that he was available. He accepted a position as a senior project engineer. The first day he went back to work, he texted me a photo of his desk. Just the desk. A cup of coffee on it. I kept that photo. The Burlington project that his father-in-law's company was running experienced significant delays after our contract ended. I did not cause those delays. I simply was no longer there to prevent them. There is a difference. And it matters to me that there is a difference. His company completed the handover with another procurement firm that charged them more and delivered less. That was their choice to make. His father-in-law's company is still operating. I do not wish him ill. I genuinely do not. What I wished, what I still wish, is that he had been the kind of man who could look at my son and see the work instead of the bloodline. That he had been the kind of father-in-law who understood that the person his daughter chose said something about his daughter, and that honoring that choice was part of loving her. He was not that man. There are many men like him. I have learned not to be surprised by them. What I want to say to anyone who has watched my son sit on a cold bench and felt something they recognized is this. The people who dismiss others based on where they came from are almost always most afraid of who those people might become. They need you to be small because it is the only way they can feel large, and the antidote to that is not anger. The antidote is simply continuing to build quietly and carefully until the morning comes when they need something from you that you no longer feel obligated to give. Charlotte is 6 now. She draws the way her father used to draw, everything spread out across the floor. Complete seriousness. Very precise little lines. Last month she told me she wanted to build bridges when she grew up because bridges let people go where they want to go. I told her that sounded exactly right. I had just pulled into the Tim Hortons drive-thru on my way back from the garden center, 2 flats of marigolds sitting in the back seat, yellow and orange, the kind my mother used to line the front path every summer when my phone rang. It was my daughter's number, but it wasn't her voice on the other end. It was a neighbor, a woman I barely knew, saying she had found my daughter sitting against the front steps of her own house, in the cold, in October, unable to stand up. I did not wait for the rest of the sentence. I left the marigolds. I left the coffee. I drove. She was still on the steps when I pulled up. She was wearing only a cardigan over her house clothes, no coat, no boots, and the temperature had already dropped into the single digits the way it does in that part of Ontario once the Thanksgiving weekend passes. Her left arm was pressed against her stomach, and her face was the color of ash. She was 7 months pregnant. I got to her before I had even properly put the car in park. I crouched down and took her face in both hands, and she looked at me the way she used to when she was very small and had fallen off something she had been warned not to climb. That look of someone who has been hurt and is only now allowing themselves to feel it because a safe person has arrived. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here." She tried to say something and couldn't. She tried again. "He pushed me," she said. "His father pushed me out the door." I will not pretend I was calm. I was not calm. I called 911 immediately, and I sat on those cold concrete steps with both arms around her, talking to the dispatcher with one part of my brain while the rest of it was doing something I can only describe as the most focused and terrifying arithmetic of my life, counting weeks, counting the distance to the hospital, listening to her breathing, watching her face. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. I counted those too. At the hospital, a nurse took me gently but firmly to a separate waiting area while they assessed my daughter. I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, and I called my brother. He is 3 years older than me and has lived in the same house in Barrie for 30 years. And when I told him what had happened, there was a silence on his end that I recognized. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a man who has already begun to think. "Which hospital?" he said. "Collingwood. I'll be there in 45 minutes. My daughter had bruised ribs on her left side, soft tissue damage to her shoulder from where she had hit the railing on the way down, and mild hypothermia. The baby was being monitored closely. The obstetrician on call, a woman with a calm, unhurried manner that I will be grateful for the rest of my life, told me that the baby's heartbeat was strong and that they wanted to keep my daughter overnight for observation, but that she believed everything was going to be all right. I held my daughter's hand in the bed, and I waited until the bustle of nurses and equipment had quieted before I asked her to tell me everything. She looked at the ceiling for a long time, then she told me. She and her husband had been living in the house. His parents owned a property outside of Collingwood, a large old farmhouse that his father had been letting them use while they saved for a place of their own. The plan had seemed generous when it was offered. My daughter had been grateful. That was before she understood that the offer came with a cost that was never written down anywhere. Her father-in-law had never accepted her. He had made this known from the beginning, in the way that cowardly people make things known indirectly, plausibly, always with a layer of deniability. A comment at dinner about people who came from different backgrounds not understanding how things were done in this part of the country. A remark about her cooking. A question, asked in front of company, about whether her family had been established here long. He had grown up in a small town and he wore that fact like armor. My family had come to Canada from the Philippines when I was 24 years old. We had worked, we had built, we had given everything to this country, and this country had given much back. None of that was visible to him. To him, my daughter was a guest in a story that did not belong to her, and he had been waiting for a reason to say so out loud. The reason came 3 days before I found her on the steps. She had asked politely, she told me. She had been so careful to be polite whether she and her husband could repaint the nursery. The room they had been given for the baby was a small one at the back of the house, and it had been used as storage for years, and the walls were a dingy beige that she found depressing. She had already bought the paint. A soft green, she said, like new leaves. Her father-in-law told her she had no right to make changes to a house that did not belong to her. Her husband was not home. Her mother-in-law said nothing and looked at the floor. The argument that followed, and I use that word loosely because an argument implies some measure of equality between the parties, escalated in the way these things do when one person has been holding back for a very long time, and the other person has been waiting to be given permission to say the worst thing they have been thinking. He told her that women from families like hers had always expected something for nothing. He told her that she should be grateful she had been allowed to live in that house at all. And then he said, the thing that I have turned over in my mind every day since, the thing she whispered to me in that hospital bed with her hand over her belly, the thing I will never forget as long as I live. He told her that the baby she was carrying had bad blood in it, that it came from her side, that his son deserved better than to have children carrying that in them. She had walked toward the front door because she needed to be outside. She needed air. He had followed her, still talking, still finding new shapes for the same ugly thing he had been saying, and when she reached the top of the front steps, he had put his hand on her shoulder. He said later it was to stop her, to calm her down, and she had lost her footing and gone down. He had not called 911. He had gone back inside. My brother arrived at the hospital while she was still telling me this. He came into the room, and he sat in the chair by the window, and he listened. He did not say anything until she was finished. Then he asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she was comfortable and whether the baby was safe. The second was whether she had ever seen any financial documents related to the property they were living on. She looked at him, surprised. She said she thought there had been some paperwork when they moved in, something about a rental agreement, but that her father-in-law had handled it and she had never seen the actual documents. My brother nodded slowly. "Get some rest," he told her. "Your mother and I are going to make some calls." My son-in-law had arrived by this point. He had come as soon as he got my message, and I want to be fair and say that he was shaken, that he sat beside my daughter and held her hand and that he cried. But I also watched his face when she told him what his father had said about the baby. I watched him go very still, and I watched him choose, in that moment, to say that his father had not meant it the way it sounded, that his father was from a different generation, that he had a temper, but he was not a bad person. My daughter looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the ceiling. She did not say anything. I stepped out into the hallway with my brother. We stood by a window that looked out over the hospital parking lot, the last light going gray behind the escarpment, and I asked him what he had been thinking in there with the questions about the property. He had been a real estate lawyer for 28 years before he retired. He was not asking about the property out of curiosity. He told me that he had a reason to believe something was not right with the arrangement my daughter and her husband had been living under. Before they had moved into the farmhouse, my daughter had mentioned to me once that her father-in-law had asked her husband to sign some documents related to the property documents her husband had described vaguely as just paperwork for insurance purposes. My brother had heard me relay this at the time and had said nothing, but he had remembered it. A man who asks his son to sign property documents but doesn't explain what they are, my brother said, is usually a man who is protecting something. The next morning, my daughter was discharged. She did not go back to the farmhouse. She came home with me, to the house where she had grown up, in the small city near Georgian Bay, where I had lived for 30 years. Her husband came too, and I will say that in those first days he was present and he was trying, even if trying was not yet the same as understanding. My brother drove up from Barrie, and we sat at my kitchen table with coffee, and he began to explain what he had started to piece together. He had done some research. The farmhouse property outside of Collingwood had been listed under a numbered company, not under her father-in-law's personal name. This was not unusual on its own. But the documents her husband had signed once my brother had gently and persistently explained to him why it mattered and what the consequences might be for his wife and their child turned out not to be insurance paperwork at all. They were documents transferring a portion of the liability for certain property taxes and a private mortgage into her husband's name, quietly, without explanation, without a lawyer present to advise him. Her father-in-law had been restructuring his assets for some time. He had property disputes with two separate neighbors. He had a lien from the municipality for unpaid taxes on another parcel of land in Grey County. He had been using his son's name, and by extension, the young couple's financial future as a buffer. My daughter sat very still when my brother explained this. Her husband sat beside her, and I watched something shift in his face. Not the slow, reluctant shift of a man being forced to see something he had been avoiding. Something faster and angrier and more honest. He used me, her husband said. It was not a question. Yes, my brother said, and he used your wife's situation to do it. As long as she was living in that house and felt she owed him something, she was less likely to ask questions. There is a moment in these situations, and I have lived long enough to have seen it before, when the person who has been told to be grateful finally stops being grateful and starts being clear-eyed. I watched it happen to my daughter's husband over the following 2 days. It was not comfortable to watch. It looked like grief at first. Then it looked like anger. Then it settled into something quieter and more purposeful. He hired his own lawyer. He did not use a family referral. My brother helped him find someone in Barrie who specialized in exactly this kind of matter. The documents were reviewed. The liability transfer was found to be improper. Her husband had not been advised of the nature of what he was signing, had not had independent legal counsel, and there were grounds to have it set aside. In the meantime, my daughter's father-in-law called twice. The first call was to his son, and it was, by her husband's account, a masterpiece of a particular kind of performance, the wounded patriarch, the misunderstood man, the father who had only ever tried to help and couldn't understand why he was being treated this way. The second call was to me directly, which surprised me, because I had never been anything more than the background of the story in his eyes. He told me that my daughter had misrepresented what had happened. He said it had been an accident. He said the family could sort this out privately, and it would be better for everyone if lawyers were not involved. I let him finish speaking. Then I said, "Your son has already spoken to a lawyer. My daughter has already spoken to the police. And my brother, who was a real estate lawyer for 28 years, is already in possession of the documents you had your son sign without counsel. So the lawyers are already involved." I was proud of how calm my voice was. Inside, I was shaking, but my voice was calm. He hung up. What happened over the following 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic in films. It was paperwork and phone calls and waiting rooms and careful, meticulous work by people who knew what they were doing. The liability transfer was formally challenged and eventually set aside. The municipality's lien on the Grey County property became a matter of legal record that could not be quietly buried. Her father-in-law's lawyer sent several letters that my brother described as increasingly alarmed in their tone. There were no criminal charges for what had happened on the steps the police had come. A report had been filed, and the Crown prosecutor had reviewed it, but the push itself was difficult to prove as intentional, and I have made my peace with that, or I am trying to. The civil record stands. The financial record stands. What I was not expecting was the phone call from my daughter's mother-in-law. She called on a Tuesday evening in late November. My daughter was at my house, and it was her phone that rang, and she looked at the screen for a moment before she answered it, and then she handed it to me without a word. Her mother-in-law had a tired voice. Not tired the way someone is tired at the end of a day. Tired the way a person is tired after a very long time of not saying the things that needed to be said. She told me she was sorry. She said she had known for years that her husband had a problem with people he considered to be outsiders, and that she had told herself it was just the way he was, that he didn't mean it, that the right approach was to smooth things over. She said she had been wrong. She said she was sorry for the baby comment. She said she had left the farmhouse and was staying with her sister in Sudbury. I listened to all of it. I said, "I appreciate you calling." And I meant it. It was not enough, but it was something. And I am not so young that I expect perfect things. My daughter's husband moved into my house in November. They took the second bedroom. My daughter nested the way pregnant women do, slowly reorganizing every surface within reach, appearing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. to check whether the soup she had made that afternoon was still covered. Her husband drove her to every appointment. He repainted the second bedroom in the soft green she had wanted for the nursery. He found the same shade. She had written down the name, and he did it on a Saturday while she slept, and when she woke up and saw it, she stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. I found her standing there. I stood beside her. I was so sure that if I was patient enough, she said, if I was careful enough and grateful enough, it would get better. I know, I said. It doesn't work that way, does it? Not with people like him, I said. No, it doesn't. She leaned against my shoulder, and we stood in the doorway of that green room together, and I thought about all the things I had worked for in this country, all the things I had built, all the years I had stood in rooms and been careful and patient and grateful in ways that were not always asked of others. I thought about my own mother, who had come here with almost nothing and died with a house full of family and a yard full of marigolds. I thought about what it means to decide that you are done being careful for the wrong people. That your patience belongs to the ones who deserve it, that what gets passed down through a family is not whatever that man had meant by blood. It is this: standing in a doorway, showing up on the steps, making the calls. My daughter's daughter was born in January. A Thursday, just past midnight, winter dark and cold outside, and blazing with light inside the delivery room at the hospital, where they had been monitoring her since October. I was in the waiting room with my brother. We had driven together and we sat with bad vending machine coffee and an old copy of a magazine neither of us read, and we did not talk very much, and that was fine. We have been not talking very much together for 60 years. Her husband came out just before 2 a.m. He was still in the paper gown they make you wear, and he was crying in a way that men sometimes cry when they have been holding something enormous and are finally allowed to put it down. "They're both okay," he said. She's perfect. She's so small." My brother stood up and put his hand briefly on the young man's shoulder. I did not trust my own voice yet, so I did not try to use it. When they brought us in, my daughter was propped up in the bed with her daughter on her chest, the baby wrapped and pink-faced, and making the small, effortful sounds of a person who has just arrived somewhere entirely new and is still figuring out the rules. My daughter looked exhausted in a way I recognized it, is the exhaustion that comes after something is finally, truly over. She looked at me and she smiled. I sat on the edge of the bed and I put my hand on the baby's back, that impossible warmth, that steady breathing. "What's her name?" I said. "Clara," my daughter said. "After your mother." I am not going to tell you I did not cry. I cried. My brother, standing in the corner pretending to look out the window, made a sound I am going to charitably describe as a cough. Clara is 3 months old now. She has opinions about being put down, and opinions about the particular rocking speed that she considers acceptable, and she is already, clearly, going to be difficult in all the best ways. My daughter and her husband have put in an offer on a house in a town 20 minutes from me. It needs work. They are not frightened of work. Her father-in-law has not called again. The legal matters are still working their way through the slow machinery of process, the way these things do. My brother says the outcome is not in question. I believe him. He has not been wrong about these things in 30 years. What I think about, On the mornings when I am up before anyone else, making coffee in a house that is a little too full and a little too loud and exactly right, I think about the steps. That October afternoon, the marigolds in the back of my car, the phone ringing, how fast everything changed, how it turned out that fast was not too late, how the worst moment and the beginning of something better were the same moment, just seen from different angles. I think about what he said, about bad blood, about what gets carried and what doesn't. My granddaughter's blood carries my mother's name. It carries 30 years of my brother's steadiness and 30 years of my own building, and it carries my daughter's patience that finally ran out at exactly the right time. It carries a father who is learning, slowly and imperfectly, to choose his family over his family's expectations. It carries a green room that smells like new paint and possibility. There is nothing bad in any of that. There never was. I was in the middle of canning tomatoes when my son-in-law called. That's the detail I always come back to. The jars were lined up on the counter, still warm, and I had that particular smell on my hands, vinegar and dill and the last of the summer garden. My husband had been gone 4 years by then, and canning was one of those rituals I kept doing alone, partly because I didn't know how to stop. When I saw it was my son-in-law calling instead of my daughter, I felt something shift in my chest. He never called me directly. In 6 years of marriage to my girl, he had never once called me first. "She's at the hospital," he said. "There was an accident." He used the word accident. I remember that too. My daughter's name is Blythe. She was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant with her second child, and she was lying in a room at Foothills Medical Center in Calgary with 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and bruising along her left side so severe the nurses thought she'd been thrown from a vehicle. She hadn't been thrown from a vehicle. When I got there, I drove the 40 minutes from Okotoks in under 30. I won't lie about that. She was awake, but barely. Her husband was standing near the window with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man whose wife had almost lost their child. It was the expression of a man doing math in his head. I pushed past him and sat beside her bed and took her hand. "Mom," she said. Her voice was so small. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here." She turned her face away from him before she spoke again. She had to work to get the words out, like each one cost her something. "She said I deserved it," Blythe whispered. "His mother told me. She said this is what happens to women who marry above themselves." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just held her hand. "The fall down the stairs," she said. "It wasn't a fall. Let me tell you about my son-in-law's mother. Her name is Rosalba. She came to Canada from a wealthy family in northern Italy in the 1980s and married into the Craddock money, old Alberta oil money, the kind that gets quieter and more entrenched with every generation. She was not warm when I first met her. I told myself that was cultural difference, or shyness, or the awkwardness of meeting a new family. I made excuses for 6 years. She had never approved of Blythe. She made that clear in ways that were deniable and ways that weren't. The offhand comments about Blythe's background: her father was a pipe fitter from Red Deer, she'd worked her way through nursing school, she didn't come from money and had never pretended otherwise. Rosalba had a particular way of letting that silence hang after my daughter said something, like she was waiting for the sentence to improve. My son-in-law, I'll call him by his name, Trent, was not a cruel man exactly. He was a weak one. There's a difference. And sometimes the weak ones cause more damage in the end, because they don't even have the conviction of their own cruelty. He did what his mother said. He always had. He was 40 years old, and he still called her every day. Blythe had tried to tell me things over the years. Small things. A trip that got canceled because Rosalba had decided they needed to be somewhere else. Money from their joint account that moved without Blythe being consulted. A job offer Blythe had been considering, a senior position at a clinic in Imagery, real advancement, that evaporated after a dinner at Rosalba's house in Elbow Park. Blythe never could explain exactly what happened. Just that after that dinner, Trent said the timing wasn't right. I hadn't understood how bad it had gotten. That's the thing I have to live with. My son is named Webb. He's 58, 2 years younger than Blythe, and he spent 20 years as an RCMP officer before his knee gave out and he moved into private security consulting. He's the kind of person who goes still and quiet when he's paying close attention, which means people often underestimate how closely he's paying attention. When I called him from the hospital parking garage, I had stepped out to get air. Or maybe I had stepped out because I couldn't look at Trent anymore without my vision going strange around the edges. Webb didn't say much. He listened to what I told him. Then he said, "Where is she right now?" "Room 422. She's stable. The baby is okay." "And him?" "Still there." "I'm 2 hours out," Webb said. "Don't let her sign anything." I hadn't even thought about paperwork. That's what he gave me. Something concrete to do. I went back upstairs and sat beside my daughter's bed, and when a woman came in with a clipboard around 7 that evening, I asked to see each form before Blythe touched it. The woman seemed surprised. I smiled at her pleasantly and waited. Trent watched me from across the room and said nothing. Webb arrived at 9:30. He walked in, looked at Trent with an expression I recognized from when Webb was about 12, and a boy at his school had been bullying his friend, and said, "You should probably go get some rest." It wasn't a suggestion. Trent left. He came back the next morning with his mother. I want to be precise about what happened at the top of those stairs, because the story matters and the details matter. And I am so tired of the details being smoothed over. Blythe had told Trent she was going to speak to a family lawyer, not divorce. She said that very clearly later to me, just to understand what her options were, what the financial picture actually looked like, because in 6 years of marriage, she had never been given a straight answer about what was joint and what wasn't. There was the house in Springbank, which was in both their names. There were investments she'd never been shown. There was a company Trent held shares in through a family trust that Rosalba controlled. She had told Trent about the lawyer appointment on a Tuesday evening. On Wednesday morning, Rosalba had come to the house unannounced. She had a key, of course she had a key. And she and Trent had been in the kitchen when Blythe came downstairs. What Rosalba said to her, Blythe told me in pieces over several days. That Blythe was ungrateful. That she had been given everything and understood nothing, that a woman from her background didn't have the right to threaten a family like theirs. And then the phrase that my daughter had held in her body like glass, "This blood of yours was never clean enough for this house." Blythe had turned to go back upstairs. She said she just needed to get away from her, just needed 2 minutes in her own room, and then she was falling. She told the hospital she'd slipped. She told them that because Rosalba was standing at the bottom of the stairs watching her and Trent was in the doorway to the kitchen and she was 7 months pregnant and alone. She told me the truth. Webb made calls. I don't know all the calls he made and I didn't ask. He still knew people, the right kind of people, the organized kind with long memories and good documentation habits. What I know is that within 72 hours we understood the following things. The house in Springbank had a second mortgage that Trent had taken out 18 months earlier without telling Blythe, using her signature on documents she'd never seen. The investment accounts she was technically co-holder of had been quietly restructured, and Rosalba had, for reasons that were not immediately clear, begun moving assets into a numbered company in New Brunswick about 8 months prior. My daughter's lawyer, her own lawyer, the one she called that Tuesday, who turned out to be a woman named something I'll keep private, a sharp-minded woman from a firm on 8th Avenue Sol W who did not seem remotely surprised by anything she was told, described what she found in Blythe's financial situation as a systematic pattern of exclusion. She said it like she was reading from a report, which she was, and the flatness of the language made it worse somehow, not better. Trent, when confronted with the mortgage documents, said Blythe had known. He said she'd been distracted during the pregnancy and probably forgotten. He said this to a lawyer in writing, and it was one of the most useful things he ever did because it meant there was a record of him saying it. The baby was born 6 weeks later, early but healthy, a girl. Blythe named her on her own. She didn't ask Trent. He wasn't there for the birth. He was at his mother's house in Elbow Park, I was told, which was where he spent most of his time by then. I was in the delivery room. I held Blythe's hand through 11 hours, and I am not a woman who cries easily. My own mother raised me out of that habit. But when that baby came into the world, I put my forehead down on the bed rail and I wept. I cried for my daughter and for the years she'd spent in that house trying to be enough, and for the child who would grow up knowing her grandmother had thought her mother's blood was dirty, and for my husband who had died before any of this happened and who would have known exactly what to do in about 30 seconds flat. My grandson, Blythe's older child who was 4, was with my neighbor. He had asked me when I picked him up the morning after the hospital whether Mama was going to be okay. I told him yes. He said, "Grandma, why does Granny Rosalba have mean eyes?" And I said, "Some people are very unhappy on the inside, sweetheart," which is the most honest answer I have ever given a 4-year-old. The legal process took 11 months. I'm not going to pretend it was clean or quick or that the system worked the way it's supposed to work, because parts of it didn't. There were delays and motions and counter-motions, and a period of about 6 weeks in the winter where Blythe's lawyer told her to be patient, and Blythe called me every night at 10 o'clock, and we talked until she could sleep. What emerged eventually was this. The second mortgage was ruled fraudulent. The documents bearing Blythe's signature were examined by a forensic document analyst. Webb knew someone. Of course, Webb knew someone, and the conclusion was that at least 2 signatures had been replicated without her knowledge. The Crown attorney who reviewed the file used the phrase reasonable grounds to believe, which is not a conviction but is not nothing. Rosalba's asset transfers to New Brunswick drew the attention of the Canada Revenue Agency. I don't know exactly how that attention was directed. I have my suspicions about who made a phone call and when, and I have chosen to feel at peace about that. Trent's family trust, which Rosalba had controlled for 30 years, became the subject of a civil suit that is still ongoing as I write this. I am not a vindictive woman by nature, but I will tell you that I check the court records periodically, the way I used to check on my children when they were small, just to make sure everything is still where it should be. There is something I need to say about the year I spent watching my daughter rebuild. She moved back to Red Deer for 3 months, into the house where she grew up, which I had kept because I couldn't bring myself to sell it after my husband passed. The 4 of us, Blythe, the 2 children, and I, lived together in that house through one of the coldest winters I can remember. And I learned that my grandson sleeps with 3 stuffed animals in a very specific order, and that my granddaughter makes a sound like a small indignant seal when she's hungry, and that my daughter, when she's finally safe, laughs at things the way she did when she was 11. She laughed at the news. She laughed at the dog next door who barked at snowflakes. She laughed at herself sometimes, which I took as the best possible sign. She cried too. There were nights I heard her through the wall, not loud, just the quiet kind of crying that happens when someone thinks no one can hear. I didn't go in on those nights. I know my daughter. She needed to do that alone. But I kept my own light on, just in case. In the spring, she got a job offer from a medical clinic in Cochrane. A good offer, a real one, the kind she'd been working toward for years. She called me from the parking lot after the interview, her voice high and a little disbelieving, and I told her she had always been exactly this capable, that nothing that had happened had changed that, and that her father would have driven to Cochrane just to tell her so in person. She took the job. She found a house, a small one, a rental to start, in a neighborhood with good schools and a park 2 blocks over. I helped her move on a Saturday in May. My son Webb drove a rented truck from Calgary and assembled furniture for 6 hours without complaint, and ate 3 sandwiches and teased his sister about her collection of houseplants, which are frankly excessive. And by evening, the kids were asleep on their mattresses on the floor, and the 3 of us sat in the kitchen with tea and the radio on low, and it felt, for the first time in a long time, like something beginning rather than something ending. People ask me sometimes, friends or women I know from church or neighbors who have followed the outline of what happened, they ask me what I would have done differently if I had known sooner, if I had paid closer attention. I don't answer that question the way they expect. I was paying attention. I noticed things. I just kept choosing to believe the reasonable explanation over the true one, because the true one required me to accept that my daughter was living inside something I hadn't protected her from. And that's not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. What I would tell any mother or any woman watching from the outside while someone she loves is slowly diminished. The moment you feel that shift in your chest, that wrong note feeling, the one I felt when I saw my son-in-law's name on my phone, don't wait for confirmation. Don't wait for proof. Start paying a different kind of attention. Don't let her sign anything. Rosalba has not contacted Blythe since the divorce was finalized. Trent sees his children every second weekend, supervised by an arrangement that was not his first choice but is now simply the arrangement. He has moved into a condo in the Beltline, I am told, through the particular channels by which one is told such things in a city like Calgary, that he and his mother are no longer speaking. I don't know what happened between them. I find I don't need to know. What I know is that on a Sunday last September, I drove to Cochrane with 2 bags of groceries and a cutting from my kitchen herb garden wrapped in damp paper towel, and my grandson met me at the door and said, "Grandma!" We made a birdhouse and pulled me by the hand to see it, and the birdhouse was crooked in the way that only a 4-year-old and a patient parent can produce together, and it was nailed to the fence post in the backyard with what appeared to be approximately 40 nails, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Blythe was in the kitchen when I came inside. She was standing at the counter, holding her daughter on her hip, and she looked up when I walked in, and she looked, I want to find the right word for this, she looked like herself, the version of herself that exists when no one is watching to find her wanting. "You brought dill," she said, looking at my bags. "End of season," I said. "We're making pickles." She smiled, and it reached her eyes, and it was real. That's the thing about resilience. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly shows up one Sunday in September, smelling like dill in the end of summer, and gets to work. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to survive something like this. Not just get through it, survive it intact with your sense of yourself still recognizable on the other side. It starts, I think, with knowing the difference between what you owe people and what you've let them take. Blythe spent 6 years being decent to a woman who had decided before they ever met that she wasn't worth decency in return. My daughter brought food to that house. She remembered birthdays. She kept her mouth closed when she should have opened it and opened it gently when she should have been loud. None of that was weakness. That was her character. The mistake wasn't in having it. The mistake was in believing that if she was good enough, long enough, it would eventually be returned. That's not how it works with people who have decided you don't belong. Being good doesn't change their minds. It just costs you more of yourself while you wait. What changed things wasn't anger. It was clarity. The moment Blythe told me the truth in that hospital room, something in her shifted. I watched it happen. She stopped managing the story and just told it. That kind of honesty, when you finally let yourself have it, is its own form of courage. It's quieter than people expect. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It feels like exhaustion that's finally run out of room to hide. Webb brought something different to all of it. He brought the kind of thinking that doesn't get clouded by what it wants the situation to be. He looked at what was actually in front of him, the documents, the timeline, the pattern, and he followed it methodically, without drama, without needing anyone to agree with him before he moved. I've watched him do that his whole life. His father was the same way. There's a kind of intelligence in that, a willingness to see clearly even when clarity is uncomfortable, and it is not a common thing. Most of us flinch. Webb just kept looking. And Blythe, what she showed me in that year, in those 11 months of legal process and cold nights and 10 o'clock phone calls, was something I hadn't fully seen in her before, though I think it was always there. She didn't collapse. She grieved, yes. She cried through the wall when she thought I was asleep. But she got up every morning and she made breakfast and she answered her lawyer's emails and she went to work and she showed up for her children with a steadiness that I honestly don't know where she found. That's not something anyone gives you. It grows from somewhere inside, from deciding that the life on the other side of the hard part is worth walking toward. Rosalba believed that money and name and a certain kind of lineage were what made a person. She built her whole sense of safety on that. And when those things started to slip, when the trust was scrutinized and the signatures were questioned and the CRA started asking about New Brunswick, there was nothing underneath. No reserve, no real foundation, just the architecture of control which turns out to hold nothing when the circumstances change. My daughter had none of those things and lost most of what she built, but she had herself. She still had that all the way through. I think about that bird house in the backyard sometimes. 40 nails for a crooked little box, built by a 4-year-old and his mother on a Saturday afternoon. There's something right about that image, that the first thing she built in her new life was something impractical and slightly ridiculous, and made entirely for something else to come home to. That's what I keep. Pulled over before I even turned off the engine. She was sitting on a bench outside the Tim Hortons on Carling Avenue, my daughter, with 2 garbage bags at her feet, and my granddaughter asleep across her lap. It was February, not the soft kind of February that sometimes sneaks through in Ottawa. The real kind, the kind that bites through your coat and doesn't apologize. I don't know how long they'd been there. I didn't ask right away. I just walked over, crouched down in front of her and said, "Come on, get up. The car's warm." She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 7 and had done something she thought I'd be angry about. Like she was waiting for me to decide what kind of mother I was going to be in that moment. I wasn't angry. I was something much quieter than that. My daughter's name is Bridget. She's 34 years old, a former accountant, and until 3 days before that morning, she had been living in a 4-bedroom house in Kanata with her husband and their daughter. Her husband's name is Warren, and I'll get to him. His father's name is Clifton Hare, and I'll get to him too. But first you need to understand who I am. My name is Sylvia Oakes. I'm 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago after spending 31 years as a senior contract manager for the federal government. I know how to read a document. I know how to find the one line that matters buried inside 40 pages of language designed to make you stop looking. I know how to be patient. I know how to wait. And I had been waiting for exactly this moment, not hoping for it, God no, but I had seen it coming for a long time. Bridget met Warren Hare 8 years ago at a work function. He was charming in the way that men who've been told they're charming their whole lives can be. Good-looking, easy laugh. Knew how to make a woman feel like the only person in the room. I noticed, the first time she brought him home for dinner, that he had a habit of finishing her sentences. She'd start to say something and he'd jump in, smooth it over, redirect. She'd smile and let him. I filed that away. His father, Clifton, was a different sort. He owned a mid-sized electrical contracting company out in the Valley, Hare & Sons, which was mostly just him and Warren by that point, and he carried himself like a man who'd never once in his life been told no. He had the kind of confidence that doesn't come from accomplishment. It comes from a long history of small intimidations that worked. When Bridget and Warren got married, Clifton gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner. He talked for 11 minutes. He mentioned Bridget twice. Both times, he mispronounced her name. I smiled and drank my wine. After the wedding, Bridget started working at Hare & Sons as their internal accountant. It was Warren's idea. Clifton supported it. At the time, she told me it made sense. She knew the family, knew the business, and the pay was good. I asked her once, gently, whether she thought it was wise to have her income tied to her in-laws. She said I was overthinking it. Maybe I was, but I don't think so. For the first few years, things looked fine from the outside. They bought the house in Kanata, had my granddaughter, Maeve. She's 4 now, all red curls and loud opinions. Gets that from her mother. Bridget seemed happy, or close enough to it that I didn't push. Warren was busy. Clifton was always there in the background, a presence in their marriage that had no name but took up space. The first real sign was 2 Christmases ago. Bridget showed up at my house in Sentrytown on the 27th, which was odd. We always did Christmas Day together. She said she and Warren had spent the holiday at Clifton's place, and she'd wanted to give me my gifts in person. She seemed tired. I made tea. At some point, she mentioned, casually, that Clifton had suggested she take a step back from the bookkeeping to focus on Maeve, that he brought in a nephew to handle accounts. "Are you okay with that?" I asked. She said yes. Her eyes said something else entirely. I didn't push, but I started paying closer attention. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, and it wasn't from Bridget. It was from my granddaughter. Maeve had learned how to use the iPad to call me on FaceTime, which she thought was very sophisticated of her. She called to tell me her mom was crying and they were outside and it was cold and could I come? I was in my car within 4 minutes. When I found them on that bench, Bridget didn't want to talk. She just shook her head and held Maeve tighter and said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I told her she had nothing to be sorry about. I got them both into the car, turned the heat up all the way, and drove to my house. I put Maeve down on the couch with a blanket and a cartoon. Then I went into the kitchen and made 2 cups of strong tea and sat down across from my daughter and waited. Here's what she told me. 3 days earlier, Warren had come home from his father's office and told Bridget she needed to leave the house. Not that he was leaving, that she was. He said Clifton had decided. And note that word, decided, as though this were Clifton's marriage to dissolve, that Bridget was not a right fit for the family going forward. Those were the words Warren used, a right fit, like she was a component that hadn't performed to spec. Bridget had asked what that meant. Warren had said that Clifton felt her background and attitude had caused problems in the business, and that it would be better for everyone if she and Maeve found another arrangement. Her background. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Vanier with me and her brother after her father left. She'd put herself through Carleton on student loans and part-time work. She'd built a career from nothing and kept his family's books clean for 6 years. Her background? I wrapped my hands around my mug and let the heat ground me, because what I was feeling in that moment was not the kind of thing you say out loud in front of your daughter. But I wasn't finished listening yet. There was more. When Bridget had refused to leave, Warren had escalated. He told her the house was in his name, which was true. They'd made that arrangement at the time of purchase for mortgage qualification reasons, a decision that had seemed practical at the time and now looked like exactly what it was. He told her Clifton had already spoken to a lawyer. He told her that if she didn't leave quietly, things would get complicated for her. So she'd packed what she could fit in 2 garbage bags, taken Maeve, and left. She didn't call me right away because, and this is the part that broke something open in my chest, she said she didn't want to be a burden. She'd been sitting outside that Tim Hortons for 2 hours trying to figure out what to do next before Maeve picked up the iPad. I put my mug down. "Bridget," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. And this is not the end of anything. Do you understand me?" She nodded, eyes wet. "Good," I said. "Now I need you to get some sleep. And I need you to let me make some calls." She didn't ask what calls. She knew me well enough not to. The first thing you should know about my retirement is that it left me with a great deal of time, and I have always been someone who uses time well. In the 2 years since I left the government, I had not been idle. I'd done some consulting work, served on the board of a nonprofit housing organization, and, relevant to what comes next, I had become, purely out of personal interest and the encouragement of an old colleague, a minority shareholder in a small commercial property company that held several leases in the Ottawa Valley. One of those properties was the building where Hare & Sons had their main office. I had not purchased that stake because of Clifton. I want to be clear about that. I purchased it because my colleague made a compelling case and the numbers were sound. But I won't pretend I hadn't noticed, when I reviewed the asset list, that Hare & Sons was on it. I'd filed that away too. The second thing you should know is that I had a very good friend named Greta. We'd worked together for 15 years in the same department, who had retired the year before me and gone to work part-time for a firm that did employment and family law. Not as a lawyer, as an intake coordinator, but Greta knew people, and she owed me a favor. the kind that accumulates over 15 years of covering for each other in difficult meetings with difficult directors. I called Greta first. By noon that day, Bridget had an appointment with a family law lawyer named Annette for the following morning. By the afternoon, I had spoken to my contact at the property company and asked some questions about the terms of the Hare & Sons lease, which was up for renewal in 4 months. I did not do anything hasty. I want to make that clear. What I did was gather information. I read documents. I made notes. I asked careful questions of careful people, and I listened to the answers. That is what I have always done. That is what 31 years in contract management teaches you if you pay attention. What I found over the following 2 weeks was this. Hare & Sons had been struggling. The company had lost 2 significant municipal contracts in the past year. One to a larger firm, one due to a compliance issue that Warren had apparently mishandled. Their line of credit had been extended twice. The nephew Clifton had brought in to replace Bridget had no formal accounting credentials and had been processing payroll through a system that, according to a very quiet conversation with a former employee who had a reason to be unhappy with Clifton, had some irregularities. Some irregularities, that's a very polite way to put it. Meanwhile, Annette had reviewed the situation with the house and had some news for Bridget. Because they had been common law for 2 years prior to the formal marriage, and because Bridget had contributed materially to the household, including 6 years of below-market rate accounting work for the family business, which could be assigned a dollar value, there were grounds for a property claim. It wouldn't be fast, but it was real. He told me things would get complicated if I didn't leave quietly, Bridget said one evening after Maeve had gone to sleep in my spare room. He was right, I said. He just had the direction wrong. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I want you to understand that. I believe in proportion. I believe that what you do should match what was done, and that anything beyond that is just cruelty with extra steps. But I also believe that people who use power to harm the people I love should have to reckon with what they did, fully. Clearly, without the option of pretending it didn't happen. Clifton Hare had looked at my daughter, a woman who had given 6 years of her professional life to his company, who had raised his granddaughter beautifully, who had done nothing wrong except perhaps trust too easily, and had decided, in consultation with no one whose opinion should have mattered, that she was not a right fit. He had then used his son as a mechanism to remove her from her own home in February with a 4-year-old without anywhere to go. He had done this because he believed he could, because he had looked at Bridget and seen someone without resources, without connections, without leverage. He had looked at her and not seen me. That was his mistake. The lease renewal for the Hare & Sons property came up in April. I was not the only voice in the property company, and I was not the one who made the final decision. But I was a voice. I raised concerns in a measured and professional way about the financial stability of the tenant and the compliance irregularities I had heard referenced. I suggested that a thorough review of their current financials be required as part of the renewal process. That was a completely standard ask. Clifton's company could not produce clean financials. The review took 3 weeks. By the end of it, the property company had declined to renew on current terms and offered a significantly higher rate to reflect the increased risk. Hare & Sons could not meet that rate. They lost their office space. Around the same time, Annette had filed Bridget's property claim, and Warren, who had been confident and dismissive at the outset, backed by his father's lawyer, found himself in a position his father had apparently not anticipated. Bridget's 6 years of accounting work had been documented meticulously because Bridget had always been meticulous, and the valuation of her contribution was substantial. The lawyer on the other side started returning calls more slowly. And the payroll irregularities. I had not reported those. I had simply made sure that the right person, someone with a professional obligation to follow up on what they'd heard, was aware they might want to look into a specific company's employment records. The rest was not my doing. The Canada Revenue Agency does not move quickly as a general rule, but they do move. By June, Hare & Sons was not in a good position. By July, Warren had stopped returning his father's calls, which Bridget told me secondhand with a look on her face that was not quite satisfaction, but was in that neighborhood. By August, Warren's lawyer had reached out to Annette about a settlement. Bridget got the house. She got it because the alternative for Warren had become considerably worse than giving it up. She also got primary custody of Maeve, who had spent 6 months sleeping in my spare room and had, during that time, learned to make pancakes, memorized approximately 40% of the Anne of Green Gables audiobook, and developed a passionate attachment to my elderly cat, Gerald. I should tell you about the moment I knew it was over, really over. It was a Saturday in September. Bridget was back in the house in Kanata, finally. There had been paperwork and more paperwork and a handoff that I will not describe in detail because it gave me a stress headache for a week. But it was done. She was home. She'd changed the locks herself. She bought a new kettle, a small act of reclamation I found very moving. I came over with groceries, and we sat in her kitchen while Maeve played in the backyard, and the trees were just starting to think about turning, and Bridget said, out of nowhere, "Did you do something, Mum, with the lease?" I looked at her. "I did what I knew how to do," I said. "Nothing more than that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long had you been watching?" "Long enough," I said. She nodded slowly. She poured more tea. She didn't ask anything else, and I didn't explain anything else, and we sat there in her kitchen that was hers again and listened to Maeve narrating some complex game to herself in the backyard, her voice carrying through the open window, making up all the rules as she went. "Clifton Hare has not spoken to my daughter since February. I don't expect he will. Men like that don't apologize. It's not in their construction. They move on to the next situation where they believe they hold all the advantages, and they learn nothing, and somewhere down the line, they make the same mistake with someone else's daughter." I think about that sometimes. I think about the women who don't have a mother who spent 31 years reading contracts, the ones who sit on benches in the cold with garbage bags and children, and don't have anyone to call, the ones who leave quietly because they were told things would get complicated, and they believed it, because no one had ever shown them otherwise. That's why I'm telling this story. Not to boast, not to celebrate what happened to Clifton's company, because I take no pleasure in watching a business fail or in whatever it is Warren is doing now in his one-bedroom apartment in Nepean. I'm telling this because my daughter sat on a bench in February and thought she had no options. She thought the house was his, the money was his, the power was his, and there was nothing to be done except pack what she could fit and try to keep her daughter warm. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. When your daughter calls you, you go. You get in the car and you drive to wherever she is, and you don't ask questions yet, and you get her somewhere warm and you make the tea first, and then you listen, and then, only then, you let yourself think about what you know and who you know and what can be done. You stay calm. You stay methodical. You do not act out of anger, because anger is loud and loud things lose. You act out of knowledge, because knowledge is quiet and quiet things last. Bridget knows that now. I think she knew it before, somewhere. She just needed reminding. Maeve is 5 now. She starts junior kindergarten in the fall at the school 3 blocks from the house that is her mother's house, the house she will grow up in. The house with the new kettle and the changed locks in the backyard where she makes up rules for games that only she completely understands. She calls me every Friday on FaceTime, same as always. She is very proud of herself for knowing how to do that. She should be. I've thought a lot about what Clifton saw when he looked at my daughter. He saw a woman without leverage. He saw someone who'd grown up without money, without connections, without the kind of last name that opens doors in the valley. He made a calculation, and in his experience, that calculation had probably worked before. Find the person with the least, apply pressure, and watch them leave quietly. What he didn't account for was that the people with the least to show often have the most underneath. Bridget never stopped being decent. Not when Warren came home with his father's verdict like she was a line item to be removed. Not when she packed her daughter into a coat and walked out the door. Not even sitting on that bench in February with nowhere to go. She didn't threaten anyone. She didn't rage. She called her mother and she waited. That kind of restraint isn't weakness. It's a form of integrity that takes more strength than most people realize, because it means holding yourself together when everything in you wants to fall apart. I think that's what I want people to take from this. Not the lease, not the CRA, not the settlement. Those are just the mechanics. What matters is that Bridget stayed herself through all of it. She stayed honest, stayed careful, stayed present for Maeve, even when she had almost nothing else. That's the part that made everything else possible. You can't build on a foundation of bitterness. You can only build on what's real. For my own part, I used what I had. 31 years of reading contracts, of knowing which question to ask and which person to ask it to, of understanding that information is not the same as aggression. I didn't act out of spite. I acted out of knowledge. There's a difference, and I think it matters. Spite burns out. Knowledge holds. I've watched people make the mistake of thinking that intelligence means cleverness, the fast answer, the sharp comeback, the impressive speech. But the kind of thinking that actually changes things is slower than that. It's the kind that happens at a kitchen table at midnight with a cup of tea and a set of documents you've read 3 times. It's the kind that knows when to wait and when to move. It took me 3 months to understand exactly what had been done to my daughter and exactly what could be done in return. 3 months of patience, of careful steps, of not acting until I was sure. And Maeve. 5 years old and she already knows how to call her grandmother when things go wrong. I don't take that lightly. Whatever she grows up to face, and she'll face things, everyone does. I want her to know that falling down isn't the end of anything. You get up, you make the call, you get in the car, you keep going. That's all any of us can do, really. You keep your integrity intact when it would be easier to let it go. You use your mind clearly when everything around you is loud and frightened, and when the moment comes, you don't run from it. You get in the car,